These are all of my 3D printed pieces of Zero's mask from Code Geass. These are all done on FDM printers at about 0.2 millimeter layer height. And it took a while to print. It took about, well, actually, why don't you guess? Let me know how many hours of 3D printing you think all of this took. Let me know down in the comments. All right, let's get to the build. This video is brought to you by Funimation and their new movie Code Geass Lelouch of the Resurrection in select theaters starting May 5th. Hey there, fellow maker! You've got Bill here today in the shop, and today we're making an epic mask for our friends at Funimation to help them promote their new movie Code Geass Lelouch of the Resurrection. I've got Zero's mask, and I 3D printed a whole bunch of parts. But a lot of work went into getting us this far, so why don't I give you a look into what it took to get these parts ready. Here's the 3D model I made of Zero's mask. I modeled all of it around this 3D scan of my own head. That way I knew it would fit me. If you don't have a scan of your head, you can make one using Make Humans free software. Give it the dimensions of your head and it'll pop out a model that should be the right size. For a look at modeling a helmet yourself, I'll have links to some really good tutorials down in the description. This helmet was built in several pieces, that way I could split it apart for printing. The visor was in 2 parts, and you can see all the seams between all of the different panels. Each of these parts has a flat side on it, and that's the side that would be laying against the print bed. I also included some holes to act as registration for later when these prints are getting glued together. I designed a mechanism for the inside of the back 2 dome parts so that one could rotate around the other, which could then rotate around the inside of the frame, just like that. This mechanism was made to replicate the way the back of this mask opens and closes when the wearer is putting it on. Finally, on the inside, you can see I added these loops here. These are to attach strips of elastic for later when I need to fit this thing on my noggin. With all my 3D files ready to go, I could send them over to my slicing software and start printing. All of these parts were printed in ABS plastic. I prefer ABS because it's a lot easier to sand than most PLAs. And I printed everything on my Ultimaker except for a couple of parts that I did on my Lulzbot Mini, and the parts came out pretty good. In total, it took about 102 hours to print all of these parts, again at 0.2 millimeter layer height for most of them. A huge portion of that was this visor. This is going to be our vacuum form visor buck. It took 22 hours to print at 0.2 millimeter layer height. And it is about 30% infill, and it has many shells on it to hopefully make the outside durable and resilient to heat. I really want to rush and glue everything together, but before that, I do think I should probably start sanding this a little bit before it's all put together. It'll just be easier to get at parts when I'm not manhandling a whole helmet. So I've got all of my sanding supplies right here so that I can start taking care of these layer lines and making it all nice and smooth. I guess that means it's time for an epic sanding montage. You never see footage of people sanding where they look like they're having a good time. Everyone's always so serious. Actually. That concludes round 1 of sanding. We'll have plenty more to do later, but along with the help of Brittany behind the camera, we got everything sanded down to 100 grit, and we've mostly knocked away all of the layer lines. The vacuum forming buck, this is going to be the visor that will pull plastic over. This got hit with filler primer and then sanded and wet sanded down to 800 grit, and I think that's going to be good enough, but that's going to be more work for later. Now, The rest of these helmet parts need to be put together. I have some ideas. I think it's going to work out really well. I designed these parts, they're going to go together like this, but I designed them with registration holes, and I modeled those in and they were printed in the model, but they're probably not the right size. So I got a drill bit so I can drill them out to fit the pegs I'm going to put in there. I've got these little pegs. These are little metal bits. They're actually finishing nails, and I used a grinding cutoff wheel to cut them into little segments. And these will provide registration in those holes so that when I glue them all together, they will be in the correct spot. So that'll get glued in there, and I'll do that all along that edge and then all along that edge there. So the first thing I need to do is go over all of these parts and drill out all those little holes so that I'm ready for all my pegs. Now I can glue in one side worth of pegs. I need to make sure I put everything together in an order that makes sense. In you go. Now these are going to provide registration, but also a little bit of strength along this seam that will be glued together, but this will give it more than just glue to hold it together. It should help make sure that it's nice and strong. So that's one side, and that'll lock into this other side. Cool, so that's held together just by those pegs. I will obviously glue it, but let's pull it apart, put some glue on it, glue it together. Just using super glue for this. If you needed more time, you could use like a 5-minute epoxy, but this seems like it'll work really well. Got the two halves each put together, and now these are gonna go together as well. And I had to go and widen some of these a bit with that drill bit, but I think we got everything to go together. Yeah, look at that. Just like so. A little bit of a gap there. We'll fix all of that. I think I can just run glue down there from the back and we'll be okay. That is the back dome of the helmet, and it should be able to rotate on these axes here. Some parts of this mask are actually a bit thinner than the one I just did. So you can see I did model in those little registration holes, but it's so thin that it's actually poking through on some points. So instead of drilling it like I had before, I'm going to use a thin piece of metal. I'm guessing steel that I got from the hardware store a million years ago. And I'm going to cut a slot in there so that it can go in the same spot right there. I'm going to cut a slot using my rotary tool and my cutoff wheel. Trim off the extra. Once it's cooled, I'll just use my snips here to cut off a little piece or a couple of them. And then these can go in the slots I just made and serve a very similar purpose to those rods I was using earlier. So that'll go, I'll cut the same slots in there. Do the same thing. So again, just using more super glue. Gonna glue these in on one side. Hit it with this stuff. And it's also glued to my finger. Yeah, it's not too bad. All right, cool. Left a little skin on the back of that, but we're okay. That feels nice and strong too. And again, just like the other piece, we'll come back and fix this seam up so you won't even see it. So I'm gonna do that on the rest of the pieces I have over there, and then we can work on the next step. All our pieces are together now, so I can finally test fit all these parts. I designed these hinges so that this should be able to rotate a little bit. It was actually, I know this isn't invented by Colin Furze, but I saw him do a similar thing with this round shield where these pins can only let it rotate so far, and this one will go in a similar space like that. There we go. It can rotate open so you can put your head in, and it can rotate closed. I 3D modeled this to fit on my head, and I'm pretty sure it'll fit, but you don't really know until you try, so check it out. And then, it closes! This is a big relief. It all seems to fit, and it doesn't hurt my ears or anything. I'll put some foam in here to keep it properly situated, but that'll be like the last thing we do. For now, I'm gonna have to work on making this thing look really pretty. This part needs to be attached as well, like right there, but I'm gonna wait until later because I gotta work on all these seams, and if I'm working with this thing dangling there, I'm gonna break it off, I'm sure of it. So I'll hold this until later. Our visor buck should fit in there really well too, so let's give that a test fit. So that will go in there, and I made this a little bit smaller so that the thickness of the plastic should be take up the gap between it, and then this part will go. There's going to be a screw hole on the back of it, and that's right there. So that's what we're looking at right there eventually, and it all looks like it wants to fit, which is a very, very good thing. We've got everything set up for the vacuum forming for our visor. The buck is here on this sort of smaller platen. This is actually the platen I built to pull space visors in for Adam Savage's Aces helmet. We've retrofitted it with a new top, so it's a little bit smaller for our thing here. Our oven is preheating right now, and I have a sheet of plastic. This is PETG. It's about 1/8 of an inch thick, or roughly 3 millimeters. I'm gonna throw it on there, heat it up, and hopefully get ourselves a visor. Heat! Okay, cool. Here we go. Vacuum. It's pretty good. This seems to have worked, as long as we can pop that out of there. It's still a little warm, so I'm gonna let it cool down, then we'll pull it out. That is really in there. There it goes. It came right out. It's a little cloudy in there, but I bet if we polish that up, we'll be good. I can definitely see through it just fine. All right, time to cut away all this excess plastic. All that work for this tiny little piece of plastic. Moment of truth. And it's pretty damn close. That looks pretty good, you guys. Again, this was all conceptual on the 3D computer machine until now, and everything seems to be fitting together, which is a huge relief. So that's great. I'm gonna call it for today and go have a beer. Our visor is ready for the next step, but we're gonna hold off on that for a little bit and deal with the seams on all of our 3D printed parts where I glued them together. Now I tried very hard to get them as level as possible, but things happen. So not only do I have to fill these seams to make them nice and smooth, but I have to level them out a tiny bit too. So some of the seams, the two parts are pretty well lined up, and some of them not as much. So I'm going to do some filling and then of course a little more sanding. There are a number of different ways you could fill in these seams. You could use Bondo or super glue, but today I want to try something I saw our friends over at Volpin Props doing. They used more filament. So we have ABS filament that we printed it with, and I have a piece of raw filament here. And using a wood burner, they were melting the plastic down into the seam. I'm gonna give it a shot and see how it turns out. Should be really good. I did a little bit of a test piece right here. Seemed to work out, although I had some practice issues. The idea here is that this is the same material as what we're working with, so it's the same density. It should sand really well and leave nothing behind. To get started, I'm working on the back of the helmet. I practiced, but I'm not confident I'm gonna nail it on the first try, so I'm gonna work on a part that I care less about. The front of the mask here is what you're gonna see all the time, so I'll hold off on doing that until I feel like I've really nailed the process. I am, of course, working with molten plastic close to my face, and I don't want to breathe any of that in. So I have my respirator, I'm in a well-ventilated area, and I've also got a fan right there to kind of blow those fumes away from my face while I'm working. If you were going to do something like this, you might want to work outside if that's an option. So yeah, I'm going to throw my respirator on and give it a shot. So I'm just heating up little bits of filament and kind of mashing it down into the seam there and blending it a little bit. It seems like it would be pretty easy to accidentally put or melt a hole through your print, so
probably worth adding more material than you think you need and then sanding it away so you don't have to do more filling later. And I guess I'm just trying to blend that in with the surrounding pieces there. One of the problems I found with this technique was this bottom part of my thing would hit like that. I don't want that. If I'm working on this seam here with the tip, I don't want to accidentally gouge the surface with the other part of it. There was actually a tip on the end of this that I sanded off to make it more round so that I could come in like this, as opposed to trying to use the side of it. That's how I accidentally did all this stuff. So I'm trying to just use the tip, keep the rest of the thing away from the part I care about. Also, this side is lower than this side, so I'm putting more filament on the lower side. There's a little bit of an inconsistency there. I also kind of wish I had some thinner filament. This is 3mm filament, and I think a thinner filament would be easier to work with, or at least easier to, it'll melt quicker and fit down in that thinner spot a little easier. All of my printers run on 3mm, so I don't have any thinner filament.
So far it's looking pretty okay. I'm gonna sand this part down and see how it looks. If you had a 3D printing pen, you could probably use that to lay filament down. I don't currently own one of those. But I still think having this flat, hot paddle to flatten everything out is super, super useful. I did a quick sanding test up here and it feels really good. It's pretty level, but it's clear that this side, I need more plastic over here. So I'm gonna try and bring it all the way out to here. Just because this side is lower, it needs a little bit more filling. But other than that, this is great. This is perfectly smooth right there. Of course, we'll prime and sand it a bit more later, but it's all filled in. It looks awesome. Here's our piece after, I don't know, maybe 45 minutes of work. You can see, since I used a different color filament for my filling there, I had to do quite a bit of filling on these two seams here, but once I sanded them down, they're nice and smooth. I've been going between this file to knock away most of the big bits and then 100 grit sandpaper to get it back down and level with the rest of it. Over here you can see just a thin line that's left, and that's all I needed to really fill that in. And in some spots, I eventually found out if one side was higher than the other, I could just sort of melt that higher part over a little bit instead of filling it with other filament. So far, everything's working out pretty good. It's just kind of time consuming, but the finish I think is gonna be a lot nicer than if I had used Bondo. Or at least it's easier to get everything nice and level since everything is the same exact material. Now, all I have to do is the same thing on this monster, which might take a while. Now, let me show you what I mean right here. This purple part is a little bit higher than this gray part down here. There's a lip here. So what I've found is I can go in and just sort of melt the higher spot over into the lower spot and fuse them together. I've also found that it's really easy to pull off a little bit of the plastic, especially when you're adding more. Here, I'll show you. When you're adding a big old hunk of plastic there, like that, I found that feathering it into the area around it makes it sand a lot easier. You won't end up with any kind of flaky bits. Once the plastic is down, you want to go back over it and smooth it into the area around it so that all of the plastic that you laid down is fused with the base material there. Anyway, I've got about 2 or 3 more hours of work to do on this, so I better get working to it. I should also put my respirator back on. Moving along here, been at this for a few hours. I've found that I can use this to fill spots in, like around this spot. I could just go in and kind of try and smooth this out, but I do need a little bit more material in some of these areas, and I can just use that as like filler like I normally would. But again, it fuses, so that'll sand perfectly. Down here you can see this corner on this print right here didn't quite work exactly the way it was supposed to, but I can lay down some more plastic on there and fix it up. I'll just have to build it up a little bit. It's hard to work in large chunks of molten plastic, so I'll add a little bit and then go in once it's cooled and add a little bit more. You want the whole bit that you're working with, the whole piece of plastic, to be molten. That way it will actually fuse to the plastic below it. I'm gonna let that cool. I'll come back in and do a little bit more, and then I can sand it clean. Also, as I work, a whole bunch of this plastic gets embedded or kind of stuck to the tip there. So I have a wire brush, and I can clean it off. And it seems to perform a lot better when it doesn't have a bunch of plastic gobbed up on the end of it. You also want to protect your eyes from these kind of fumes. Now this fan should help a lot, but if you have some good safety goggles, which you should, probably worth wearing those too. Make sure you don't get the fumes in your eyes, your lungs. Stay safe out there. He's more dust than man. It's been a couple hours and the mask seams are all filled in. Now I still have plenty more work to do on this, but before I do that, I'm gonna spray all these parts with filler primer. If there are any small imperfections or any of the 3D print layer lines still hanging around, this will fill them in. In fact, it's the end of the day right now, so I'm gonna douse all of these things and let them dry overnight so that in the morning, they'll be ready to go for another round of sanding. Also, this part, the nose part here, I'm gonna hold off to attach that for a while because odds are good I'm gonna break that off. Another thing is this stand, just a piece of wood with a clamp on it, is gonna be perfect for holding this while I paint it. And I think these other ones I'll just hang, spray them, and then hang them up and let them dry. Our filler primer has had all night to dry. It's looking really good. Before I jump in and do even more sanding, I need to do a little bit more filling in some specific spots. There are a couple of spots where the filler primer did not fill in all of the texture left behind. So I have this air drying spot putty and a little spatula, so I can use that to fill those in. And I'll let those dry and then we will do more of our sanding. While I'm working on that, I want to tell you about our sponsor and the movie that this mask is from. Code Geass Lelouch of the Resurrection is a new feature-length film from Funimation. It's also a direct sequel to one of the most popular anime movies of all time, Code Geass Lelouch of the Rebellion. The movie launches May 5th. That'll be with Japanese language and English subtitles, or a couple days later on the 7th and 8th in English dub. The great news is too that you can go get advance tickets right now if you head on over to funimationfilms.com/codegeass. Thank you so much to Funimation for sponsoring this video and this entire build. We'll have links to the movie down below so you can check it out for yourself. Now what I'm going to do is let this dry and get to more sanding. My spot putty is drying, but I can get started on some of my sanding, and this is what we're looking to correct. There's still some of those print lines left. Now they're filled with our filler primer, so I'm gonna start sanding away with this 320 grit sandpaper to try and remove that texture there. We want this to be nice and smooth. The good news is this filler primer is a lot easier to sand than our 3D printing filament. So I can see the lines still, and I want to sand them until they disappear. I found with the print lines, if you sand perpendicular to the lines, that seems to be the most aggressive way to get rid of them. You can also do more of a wax on, wax off sort of thing. This area right here is all nice and smooth. Things are going pretty well. I did jump down to 220 grit, so this is a little more aggressive. Some of these spots just need that extra bit of tooth to get down through all those lines. This hasn't dried yet, so I'm not going to sand that yet, but I'll try and get everything else. We got everything sanded down to 220 grit, but before I move on, I want to attach the nose piece here. And I've got a couple of little spots for pegs to go, and I've got my little metal pegs just like before. Just have to drill these out. Drill these guys out. There we go. Looks centered. You can give that a squirt Brit. Thank you. Now what I have to do is fill in that seam, and I'm just gonna use some body filler for that. About that much. Just need to fill that seam in. So this is similar to that green air drying putty that we have, but this is catalyzed. We mix in a catalyst so that it's not going to air dry. There's a chemical reaction that's causing it to turn solid. This will cure rock solid in about half an hour, and then I can sand it nice and flush, and you'll never see that seam. If you're doing a lot of this type of work, you definitely want to wear a respirator, work in a well-ventilated area. I'm just patching up a tiny little spot here, but this is polyester. It's pretty nasty stuff to breathe. Our filler is pretty much all cured, but I can poke the bit that I mixed over here to make sure so I don't ruin it. So now I can take my file and work this back down to the original shape with the seam nice and filled in. Seams all filled in there, and now I'm doing the whole mask with 320 on over everything. This will get it ready for the last round of priming and then one more round of sanding. Looking pretty good here. I've got a scouring pad just to kind of buff everything up, and now I'm going to take it over by that giant open door and spray a bunch of primer on it. This will be the last layer of primer, I hope, and it will fill in any tiny imperfections and show any large ones that we may still have to handle. Hopefully, it's all set. Our visor here needs to get tinted, but before we do that, I want to polish it up the best I can, and I'm going to use this stuff here, this Novus stuff. You go from 3 down to 1, so we'll do one round of this guy to start with and then work our way down. This is essentially like sanding, only with polishing compounds. I also grabbed some of these cotton pads for doing the wiping so that they're nice and soft, and I'm going to polish both inside and out. This is really just sanding in disguise, just more sanding. Should have named my company Sanding Props. That would have been a good name. If there's any residue left over on the inside of the mask from where it touched down to the vacuum forming buck, this would take care of it. Got a good polish on there with the first one, and we're going down to number 2. Different color even. We'll do the same thing. More polishing. We're looking super shiny here. Time for the last step. This is the number 1, and it's a spray. It goes everywhere. Last bit of polishing and cleaning on our visor. It's time to dye our visor. We've done this before. If you see the video we did where we made a visor for Adam Savage's Aces helmet, we did the same thing. This is a synthetic fabric dye. It needs to be synthetic to work on this PETG plastic. Going in this cauldron of hot water, and we're gonna do some dyeing. So now we have our witch's brew. Mix that up a little bit. Give our visor a little dip in the hot tub. Our dye bath is at 140 degrees Fahrenheit, which is exactly what we want. Put some wires on my visor, and it's gonna go right in the bath. Just like that. It can just go below the surface, and then I'll just bend these wires over to keep it there, and we'll let it soak for 5 minutes. Our soup's done. Delicious soup. That is already crazy dark. Much darker now. So I'm going to take it out of there and give it a rinse in some cool water. And we can see just how much that already tinted it. That's really good, but I'm going to dunk it back in there for another 5 minutes. It'll get a little darker. We can keep that up until it gets to the color we want. 5 more minutes. That was 5 5-minute dunks in our bath, and that looks pretty good. But this here is just about ready to go. I'll just dry it off. We can finish the rest of the mask. Our primer is dry, and it looks really, really good. You could just paint it at this point, but I want it to be a little more smooth. So I'm gonna do some wet sanding. This is 600 grit, got my water. We're just gonna sand every surface down again so that it's even more smooth, and then we can paint it. But until then, we have just a tiny bit more sanding to do, a little bit. Looking for any spots that still have some sanding lines from the previous grits. I don't necessarily have to sand all this primer off, but I might end up sanding a lot of it off. What happens with these really finer grits is you make a lot of really fine dust, and that dust clogs up your sandpaper, so when we're dunking it in there, we're actually washing a lot of that off. But it also keeps all this fine dust from getting in the air, which is nice, because then you don't have to breathe all that in. So that's why we're wet sanding, and that's how we get this to a nice high grit, make it all nice and shiny. Make it shine. With the tiny details that are the most fun, really tedious parts. Our wet sanding is done. I got everything nice and cleaned and dried off. But before I put any paint on, I've got a tack cloth here, and this will pick up any dust or any specks of stuff that are just lingering on the surface so that they don't end up in the paint job. I'm gonna give everything a good rub down there and prepare everything for painting. This is the same setup I had for all the priming. So I've got some hooks to hang it up. Here we go. This stuff is kind of, as the name would suggest, tacky. It's a little bit sticky and it grabs onto anything that's loose. Everything's good to go for painting, and I'm going to start with a base coat of black paint. This is the paint we're going with, some Createx. We'll do a couple of layers, but we're going to start with the black on everything in our airbrush. This Createx recommends a PSI of 40, which is quite high, but it's also kind of thick. So if you, like me, had trouble spraying it, read the bottle and it'll tell you 40 PSI instead of the usual 20 I do with other airbrush paints. All right, let's do this.
Like all that sanding paid off. It's so shiny.
Given the black paint some time to dry, now it's time for the color. I'm going with a purple, but this is a mixture of this pearlized white, which is actually fairly translucent. It doesn't cover very well, but I mix it with this opaque purple. 50-50 in this little jar here. Nice and simple math. That's what I'm going to airbrush all over everything. I got to this by doing a few tests. This is too bright, this was pretty good, and then I had a 3D print that had failed, and I used that after sanding it to do a little bit more of a paint test so that I know that's what it's going to look like when I spray it on there. No surprises. This is the part of the build where we're almost done. We don't want any surprises.
Oh, it's so pretty. I hope it looks as good where you're standing as it does here, because it looks good.
It is the next morning and our mask is all dry. The next thing we need to do is do some masking. The part around the, I guess it would be the bezel, around where the visor is going to go, this needs to be gold and the top part needs to be silver. So I'm going to mask all of it off and do a little more airbrushing. Time for my favorite kind of tedium. This piece was my paint test, and I'm going to use it to see how dry the paint is. Now, I did leave it overnight. It should be fine, but I'm going to really press this masking tape into the surface and then peel it off, and nothing came off. So since this and this were painted at the same time, this should be totally dry and ready for masking. This is one of my favorite tapes from Chimera. And since this line is nice and straight, I should be able to just get the edge of my tape right along that edge in there with my thumbnail, just like that. To go around this curve here, I'm putting multiple pieces of tape down. I can use my thumbnail to kind of help it in there. Also grab these silicone sculpting tools. That's nice and soft. It's not going to ruin my paint job. That can help us. And then once I have a bunch of these laid out, I can take a brand new blade, this is very sharp, and run it carefully down that seam, like so. There we go. When I peel it, we have a perfect edge on that mask, and that's what we're going to paint. All of our edges are masked off, but now I need to cover the bulk of it, and I've got this wacky tool which attaches some tape to the edge of a piece of paper. Pretty handy. That's going to go right there. I can trim it to size, and then grab some more tape and tack it down on the sides here so that no paint is going to leak around these things. There we go. Nice and covered up. I don't need all this. That can all get tucked under or something. But yeah, looking good. Our masking is all set. Now it's time to spray down the color. The bottom is gold and the top is silver, but I'm gonna paint the whole thing gold, then mask off the bottom and paint the top silver so we have nice consistent layers of paint. I swapped over to Tamiya paints, mostly because they dry really fast and I love the finish, which means I had to turn the PSI down on my compressor to 20 PSI for these paints. I also thinned it a tiny bit with some of their thinner. Gave the gold a couple hours to dry and it seems like it is dry enough to mask. And I have to mask the top half off. There's a little line right here that separates the two parts. I'm gonna cover most of it with this paper taping tool, but the seams, the important parts, I'm gonna use the good tape to get a really clean edge on that. And then I'll use my paper to cover the whole bottom of it. But this edge is the really, really critical part. Now I can cover off the entire bottom of the mask. Make sure I cover that part too. I was going to use the chrome silver paint that I have, but a while ago it suffered a crack and started leaking. I thought I had fixed it, but I did not. It's totally dry. I ran to the store and they were all out of these, but I got this rattle can of a similar Tamiya paint. It should be nice and easy to apply. I've given the silver a little time to dry. I'm probably gonna avoid touching it, but I can start taking off all this masking paper and masking tape to see how it turned out. Oh, that's so clean. Oh, I'm very happy with that. That looks nice. Oh, that's nice. For our clear coat, I'm going with this catalyzed stuff. You take the top off and you pop it, which mixes a catalyst in here. This can will be good for 48 hours after that. I'm gonna use it right away and do probably 2 coats. I'll put 1 coat on here, let it flash for about 10 minutes and then another coat. Then we'll let this thing cure overnight and it should be nice and glossy and durable. This stuff is particularly nasty, so I've got the big door open. We have some fans going to blow everything outside and I'm gonna wear my respirator.
It looks so good and shiny.
Look at how shiny it is. We left this to cure overnight. It is rock solid, the finish on here, and it is super glossy. Now it's time to put most of these parts together, starting with the visor. And I have to drill a hole in this so that we can attach it to the helmet on the inside of here with a screw. Clean the edges up a little bit. This screw can go through there and it'll protrude just enough to grab onto the nose piece. There's a hole in the back of this piece and this screw should thread right into it. Should. There we go. I think I got it in there. Yep. Now that is not held in there very strong, but it is in the right place. The rest of this is getting held in with hot glue and I'm gonna do a little bit at a time, just work my way around the perimeter. That looks pretty fantastic in there. Now to get this to stay on my head, it is more of a mask than a helmet. So in my 3D model, I designed these 3 points where I can attach elastic so that it'll go over my head like a Jason Voorhees hockey mask style. Got some pieces of elastic here and some slides. Eventually this could be done permanently, but I'm gonna put it on slides so I can adjust it to fit me exactly perfectly. It should slide right through. And then I can run it through this slide so that it holds on. There we go. We got one side, we'll do the other side. Be able to put it on my head. While I'm messing with this, I want to take one last opportunity to thank the sponsor. That would be Funimation and their new movie, Code Geass. Links down below if you want to go check that out and see where this helmet came from. So thank you for making this video possible. Of course, I would be remiss if I didn't thank the members of our Extra Credit Club for the support over the years. We have a link down below so you can check out how to join the Extra Credit Club yourself and get access to some exclusive behind-the-scenes content. Let's see if this fits. Not too bad. I definitely need some foam in here so it's not resting on my forehead, and it could definitely be a little bit tighter. Of course, as usual, all the tools and materials we used for this one are linked down in the description if you'd like to follow along on this build or a similar build. We really do encourage you follow along because this is super, super fun kind of work, especially when the payoff is so shiny. These bits of foam are gonna rest on my forehead, keeping the mask away from my face and hopefully a lot more comfortable. I'm just holding these in while the hot glue cools off, but it's a great opportunity to remind you to subscribe if you haven't already, because we do builds like this every single week. I did add a strap to the top of my head here to hold it up on my head, and that, again, I can adjust it if I need to change the tightness on it, but that looks like it's gonna be pretty good. The last step here will be to install these dome parts. And they just pop right on. And there are little pegs in there, like that. And then this one goes in right behind it. It still works. Yeah, let's put it on and see how it looks. It's amazing. It's just my face is gone and it's all shiny. Ah, I love it. I feel like a superhero.